That should be doing.
Yeah, if you want to just go back one slide so we can get on the recording.
Okay. Hang on, let's just escape. Let's redo it again.
Okay.
Murphy's definitely visiting here today.
Yes.
Okay, that should be better. Is that okay now?
No, go ahead and share.
There you go.
There you go. Thank you.
That's all right. Anyway, I'll say that again, basically. So basically, this is running a QRP DXpedition. It's not followed in any books or anything else, basically. It's just it's talking about my own experiences over the last few years since I've been licensed. For those who don't know, basically, I was originally trained to be a mountain guide a long, long time ago. This is actually me in the Alps. It's one of those sort of like lovely sort of like propaganda photographs that the advertisers used to love. I'm actually standing there in my underwear at the time, to be honest. It's about -20, but in the direct sunlight, it was incredibly hot. Hence the Union Jack on the back of the neck, covering myself. Anyway, what's important about QRP is basically, ever since I've actually been mountain climbing, etc., if you can't carry it yourself, you can't carry it in, you can't carry it out, you don't take it. So I'm not one of these fans of literally major QRO expeditions for that reason, basically. I've usually literally run on the basis that if I can't put it in a rucksack and carry it myself, or a team of you carry it, basically, don't bother. It's just, there's just too much kit. I never liked any of the sort of like the big DXpeditions to the mountains and all the rest of it. He used to literally take everything sort of like literally put ropes right up to the summit. It doesn't make sense. It didn't make any sense to me then, and it doesn't make any sense to me now. It was George Dobbs who turned around and pointed out the fact that basically keep things simple, and that's my ethos ever since. Right. The talk's obviously about DXpeditions. There are quite a few different explanations for this one. Usually, the three characteristics that fit is basically you're /P for starters. You're not in your shack. You're not in your normal country, and you're at least 1,000 miles away from your own DXEC. So basically, that's what I'm going to be talking about. I know there are people who literally will talk about running running DXpeditions and all the rest of it, where basically they're literally just down the road. Yes, that works, that helps, but that's not what this talk's about. I've operated in a lot of different locations. I was actually just going through everything and trying to see where exactly I've been and what photographs I've got, etc. And these are just a few places. Having said that, though, let me go back one. Most of my trips have actually been accidental DXpeditions as opposed to on purpose DXpeditions, or they've happened for other reasons. So the first thing is basically I traveled all the way from one side of Canada to the other one, basically, and the main reason for the trip was there was a wedding in the middle of it. So I convinced the wife basically to allow me to take some radio along, so I did. All of the little sort of pins you can see in the diagram there basically are where I actually managed to hole up for at least a day and operate. So I had great fun. That was quite a while ago, basically. I was licensed in 2003. That was about 2004 or thereabouts. So I was dumped into operating DX very, very rapidly indeed. What was interesting was basically, especially in North America, I was operating QRP. The concept of someone literally operating out away from UK, basically. Anthony, I think someone needs to mute a mic.
Yes, please, again, everyone, if you could please mute your microphone. If you just came in, please mute your microphone.
I'd accept this if you're not going. Ah, thank you. You're going to take that and you put it in the car. Do you got the better bun? Yeah, that's it. Just getting a buff. Go and change your bun before it goes.
Please, can someone mute their mic? Okay, basically. Anyway, so that was the Canadian trip. Basically, from there I actually ended up very soon after that. I ended up working in Switzerland, which was a great experience for me. A bit like Hans, basically. I was an IT guy at the time, and I had an opportunity to actually go and spend weekends in Liechtenstein. Those of you that may know and have actually operated, have actually contacted people from there. It's HP0. It's actually one hell of a decent rare DXEC. That isn't on the air very often. So I had an absolute blast where basically it was only 90 minutes from where I was actually living at the time, basically. And so every other weekend, basically, I was able to actually sort of go and operate. The details of what I was doing are there. The picture you can see, basically, I had a fishing pole antenna. I used to sit on a bench with my little tiny radio, tuner, a hat because it got sunny. When it got sunny, it gets very, very hot there, and operated and had great fun. After that, I decided it'd be kind of fun to literally do something a little bit more distant. And what happened is my wife was actually, her uncle was basically a teacher in a school out in Mauritius, which is in the southern half of the Indian Ocean. Some of you will recognize the call sign, 3B8. Anyway, so I had a chat with Jackie, 3B8 Charlie Foxtrot as his call. I'd actually operated with him. 2008, I don't know if anyone's got any memory of this one, basically, but it was right at the low spot of the last sunspot cycle. The sun had absolutely no spots on it whatsoever. So people turned around and said I was absolutely nuts to even remotely try, but I did anyway. But the best bit of all is I actually went out there, had a chat with Jackie. Jackie turned his shack over to me. You can see there's actually a 100-watt rig and an alpha amplifier right in the middle there, basically. I didn't actually use those. My rig is a tiny little FT817 that's sitting on the bench. But what I did get is I did get the opportunity to use his antennas. So it was a lot of fun. So again, if you're going to go and do a DXpedition, basically, it's kind of fun sometimes to actually go and use someone else's shack. If I roll forward a few years, basically, I travelled out to American Samoa. Now, what was great fun for me was basically I went out to American Samoa, and whilst I was on the way out there, basically, I actually stopped off in Hawaii. And I met some of the guys who'd actually activated American Samoa the first time around about 30 years beforehand. They all turned around almost across the board and said, whatever you do, don't do what every single DXpedition to American Samoa does. Don't stay in the hotels, or there's a place you can actually rent on the south of the island. Get yourself up to one of the beaches on the north of the island instead, which is exactly what I did. The picture on the right, basically, you can see, very, very simple, fishing pole, basically, antenna, basically, with a vertical dipole, basically, on the beach, and I just tested it to see what it was like. I ended up actually operating there for about 4 days, basically, with a full square on 20 meters and another one on 40 meters. And I had a blast. It was great fun. If people turn around and say, basically, you can't actually connect to anywhere when you're operating QRP and DX, you can. But what was even more fun was basically on the trip back from there, I ended up stopping off with someone in Texas, in Houston, and operated his radio there, who'd actually managed to actually contact me in the pileup when I was in American Samoa. So I managed to actually have two-way QRP QSOs. So that was lots of fun. One of the things that I've done an awful lot of, and I'd suggest is probably a good idea for a lot of people, is to probably mix your DXpeditions with contest operating. Now, one of the things I get involved with an awful lot is IOTA contests. I used to go out to the islands in Sweden a fair amount, which is the reason why after a while they decided to let me have the short call sign of Sugar Delta 7 Bravo, which was a major sort of kudos for me, because otherwise, basically, Sugar Mike 7/Mike 1 Kilo Tango Alpha /P is a hell of a long call sign if you're actually operating on CW. The picture you can see, basically, again, this is just testing, but what I ended up doing is I took 3 10-meter fishing poles out, and I actually operated during the contest, basically, on 80 meters, 40 meters, and 20 meters. But what I did afterwards, basically, after the contest, I tried to see what would happen if I could actually use all 3 of them as face verticals, or actually as a 3-element 20-meter vertical Yagi, for want of a better word. it worked. It was great fun, and I managed some DX contacts I never thought I was going to before. Some of you may know I actually visited Gambia and Senegal a few times. When I was in Gambia the last time, basically, I was there for the BERU contest, which is the feather on the bottom left. But in addition to that, I actually operated from an IOTA. The IOTA is basically a sandbar, which was part of a lighthouse complex off the Gambian mainland, and my entire setup, for want of a better word, is what you can actually see on the right hand side. All of the radios that were essential are those that are in the bright yellow bags. These, for those that know who actually go canoeing and such, they're what are called watertight or float bags. If these go in the water, basically, they don't leak. So what I do is basically, as I was on the trip on the way out there, tied a piece of string and a rope on them. So if the boat capsized, which happened the previous year, basically, when I went out there, these would literally just pop up and bob up and down on the surface, so you could actually collect them. It's one of those things you probably have to think about if you're going to do DXpeditions to some of these locations. Yet again, I did another trip. I found this location on Airbnb of all places, and it's an American guy, basically a guy called Scott, who lives just outside Atlanta in Georgia, and he built this for his family, and for several months of the year it wasn't being used. So I turned around and asked him basically whether I could borrow it, and he agreed, which was great fun. But the best bit of all was there wasn't anyone either side for a good 300-400 meters, which basically meant I had lots and lots of opportunity to actually put up all sorts of antennas. And this is one of the places where I managed to actually put up full square on 80 meters and 40 meters at the same point in time. You can see me literally playing around literally with some antennas, both putting together at the bottom of the stairs. And that funny contraption you can see in the other photograph is actually a drying rack. When they go out and catch game fish, etc., they hang them up there to dry. Well, for me, it seemed like a wonderful opportunity to actually tie some fishing poles to. So it was a case of just use what was available. Anyway, so that's what I've done. So let's just talk about what QRP DXpeditions is all about. The first thing you need to do is you've obviously got to have a will to actually want to do it. After that, it's a case of you've got to do your research. You need to literally investigate as much as you can and get as much information as you can for the location you're going to. Now let's back up a little bit there. I hit the keyboard. I think everyone knows Google Maps, so let me try to see if I can actually come out of this and literally go across, and I want to just show you what's possible. Anthony, you ready for this?
If you have any trouble, click the stop share button and then start resharing again.
Okay, we'll do. Okay. Right, just to show people what's possible. Can people see? Sorry, Anthony, can you see this photograph?
Yes, yes, I
Okay.
can.
This photograph, for obvious reasons, it's a beach with sea in front of it, etc. If I zoom out of it a bit, you can obviously see what the location is. This is American Samoa. This is live off the internet right now. The reason why I picked this is because the location that was in the previous photograph that I was showing basically was this beach. I put my antennas up here along the beach. So there's that. One of the other locations let's have a look. This here is right in the center is the hut that I was talking about that was actually in the Bahamas. If I scroll out, you can actually see where we're talking about. Yeah. The last one, basically, I showed you the photograph of me in Sweden, basically with the antennas that I'd actually used as a 3-element Yagi on the beach. They were actually lined up along here. You can probably see just the bottom left center I don't know if I can, let me see if I can annotate this. Second, annotate it. Just here, that's a shelter, basically. So I ended up putting my my station inside it. So basically, if the weather got bad or it rained or whatever else, basically, I'd be fine. I ended up putting on this ridge here my antennas. That was the water. So at high tide, the water came all the way up here. Again, you couldn't have even remotely thought about trying to find this location if you weren't using Google Maps. So basically, it's one of the things that's very, very useful if you're actually going to try and do a DXpedition, QRP or otherwise. But definitely, if you're going to do a QRP DXpedition, you need to basically make certain or have a look and see if you can find that 3 dB advantage by actually getting your antennas right on the water side, by the side of the water, especially salty water. Anyway, was that all right, Anthony? Did that work? Yeah.
Yes,
I'm going to ask at this point, has anyone got any questions?
If you have a question, please press your space bar to unmute your mic. Not hearing anything.
Okay, I'll carry on going then. Let's go back to the presentation. Anyway, so yeah, so Google Maps I found is absolutely invaluable. The amount of information you can actually get by looking at maps and satellite photographs of the locations you're going to is huge. These days, especially in the last sort of 10 years or so, basically, it's very, very easy to get all sorts of tourist maps, hotel maps, Airbnb locations, anything off websites. The picture you can see at the moment, basically, what you can see on the bottom right-hand corner is actually the layout of all of the lodges effectively from a hotel in West Africa. So it's technically speaking possible for you to turn around and actually, after you've booked whatever, to turn around and say, can you make certain I get this particular lodge or whatever, which basically means your location for operating is, you've got an advantage already. It's incredibly important, basically, to be able to actually also speak to any operators who've also been in that location before. A little while ago, I turned around and mentioned, basically, when I was on the way down to American Samoa, I stopped off in Hawaii. The photograph on the left-hand side, basically, is I'd literally just operated the station on the USS Minneapolis, or Missouri, sorry, Missouri. And basically, Bob, KH6 Oscar, introduced me to a couple of the guys who'd actually activated American Samoa 30 years beforehand. These were the guys that turned around and said, basically, don't go to the south of the island, immediately go to the north of the island. Again, it was local knowledge that makes an awful lot of difference. One of the questions that I get asked an awful lot is basically, can you actually just turn up in these places and operate? A lot of them you can, and some of them you can't. Basically, what you need to do is you need to investigate whether or not your license has either got reciprocal rights for Americans in particular, or you've got what's called CEPT abilities. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't apply usually to either novice or intermediate licensees. It only happens to full licensees. But basically, what it means is that you can actually take your privileges effectively from the UK, in my case, and travel just about anywhere as long as it's part of it, as long as it's CEPT. There are an awful lot of locations that are not CEPT. Mauritius, for instance, basically, you had to actually apply for a license. The Gambia, I had to apply for a license. There are some places, when I went to Mauritius, there were special restrictions. At the time, you weren't allowed to actually operate any radio portable. So basically, the idea of me literally turning around and taking my radio, which I'd normally do, down to a beach and operate, didn't happen. You had to only operate from someone else's location. The same thing happens in a lot of different countries where basically they will actually allow radio operators to actually operate on the basis of some sort of reciprocal agreement, but you have to actually find a local in that country to actually allow you to operate their shed. Why do I mention this? Simple reason is, this is since the advent of the internet and Airbnb, rent-a-shack seem to have taken off hugely. Why would you even contemplate doing it? Well, the major reason is on the right-hand side, basically, you can see this particular shack basically was way back in 2012, but this was in Senegal. There was an entire antenna farm available. this was one of these stations over a period of about 8 years, had been set up by a major contest group. They used to only turn up for the ARRL contest, but the rest of the time, basically, these antennas used to sit there idle, doing absolutely nothing. So I actually had a chat with the person who actually owned it, and said, is there any way I can actually come along and operate? He said, yep, sure, fine, no problems at all. The photograph on the left-hand side is actually me operating from the shack. So that was a picture inside, and the one on the right is a picture on the outside. The temperature differential is huge. You actually, there's a fan there, but basically there was air conditioning. It was 36, 37 degrees centigrade outside the shack, but inside the shack, it was sort of closer to about 16 or 17. So there's advantages for doing rent-a-shack as well. If you don't do rent-a-shack, what exactly does a QRP portable station look like when you're out and about? Let's get the next slide up. Here we go. Sorry, Murphy's arrived. It's slowed everything down. Please, right, here we go. One of the early photographs I showed you was the layout of all the villas effectively on a beach in Gambia. That's the picture you've seen on the left-hand side. The one in the middle and the one on the far right, basically, that's me on the island off the West African coast. The very, very bottom, I had a tent on the right-hand side. Basically, I had it for about 48 hours or thereabouts, right on the beach, and operated the radio from there. And on the left, basically, my shack was one of these tiny little huts that they actually have all over the place on Swedish islands. So again, there's no two locations where basically you tend to have exactly the same setup. So you have to be a little bit flexible. But the only thing that's probably common in most of these basically pictures is I use a buddy pole. One of the other things you need to do, there's a talk a little bit later on today basically by Steve Nichols. I'd advise anyone who's even remotely thinking about doing DXpeditions to actually make certain you listen into his talk. You need to basically make certain you do some propagation analysis before you go on your trips. The picture you can see on the screen, basically, I was asked by one of the locals here in Cambridge, basically, could I turn around and tell them what was the possibility of being able to actually contact me when I was over in American Samoa? You can actually see on the on the right-hand side in the pictures, basically, I've done this on the basis that I'm only operating 8 watts. That's the sort of picture you would get. For obvious reasons, if this is a QRO station, basically, almost everything on this graph would be red, but it's not in QRP. So if you're going to do a QRP DXpedition, you need to actually have a look at your propagation. Any questions to that one? No. Anthony, any questions raised? No?
No, not seeing any questions. If you have any questions right now, you could just go ahead. I hear one. Go ahead. No.
Okay. One other thing I find is very, very important if you're going to do a QRP DXpedition as opposed to a normal DXpedition is you've got to get your objective setting correctly. What I mean is basically QRP is hard enough anyway, but you need to basically make certain you set some sort of benchmark for, has this been a success? Has it worked? So basically, you'll feel happy doing it. At the end of the day, this is a hobby. This is going to be fun. So basically, it's very, very important you turn around and literally have a think or an analysis. Why are you going to do this trip? Are you going to do this just because? Or are you going to do this because you want to get as many QSOs as possible or as many DXCCs as possible? My tally when I went to Mauritius, 68 DXCCs, not bad for a QRP operator. I've actually managed to break through the magic 100 barrier on a couple of trips, but basically, it depends what you want. But I would advise what you need to do is you need to figure out what is going to be your measure of success when you actually go and do one of these trips. Is it making a single QSO? Is it just being there and operating? Whatever. But you need. My suggestion is you need to actually figure out what exactly is your measure for success. Now, we've talked an awful about the theory, but basically, let's figure out exactly what exactly do you need to take with you when you do these trips. Now, unfortunately, you don't tend to literally have your Radio Shack or something similar down the road. So you need to basically make certain, if Murphy turns up, it's not going to turn around and literally completely cancel everything out. You've probably spent an awful lot of money on the trip. You've planned it. You've taken a lot of time on it. So one of the things that's important is actually take a couple of rigs, not just one, but two. I'll show you some photos I'll show you some examples in a second. Basically, these don't have to be the biggest things on earth. I tend to travel with two laptops. Again, I'll show you a photograph in a second. Where basically, I've got I tend to buy two laptops at the same time, basically, which basically means they're identical. So basically, if I can use one, I can immediately use the other one. Lock and lock boxes. They're familiar in America, Anthony. Yes. Yes.
I think a lot of people talked about you're talking about Pelican boxes and those type of.
Yeah, there's Pelican boxes, but I'm talking about the much cheaper sort of lock and lock boxes
Yes.
that people would use in sort of like their groceries and stuff. They are valuable. Let me see if I can find.
Yeah, the term. I'm not sure the term here. Are they the ones that collapse?
No, well, you get the ones that collapse, but the other type are the ones that actually sort of lock and they look. Let's stop sharing for a second. They look like this.
Okay.
They tend to be small, but the thing is, they're ideally placed for you to put all sorts of bits and pieces into them. And the best bit of all is they're watertight, they're airtight, they do whatever else they need to. In this particular one, basically, I've got a whole load of antenna bits and pieces in it. There's a balun in this one. You can tend to get these in all sorts of sizes, from the little tiny itty bitty things all the way up to the very, very large things. These are important. It's a bit similar to literally buying large boxes or bankers boxes or those sort of things. Likewise, actually, whilst I'm not doing the presentation, I'll show you a few things. Here we go, the Pelican box. This is actually my both carry-on and check-in bag. So you can put just about an entire radio station in that one, and it's travelled. This one, particular one's travelled everywhere. These little things, you can get them for 110 volts as well. If you're going to turn around and go on a DX trip, basically, it's going to be important that you connect your power supply or something, your rig up. The last thing you want to do is to turn around and connect your major rig up to a main supply that you don't trust. One of those things is vital. You can probably pick them up for sort of like 20 or 30 pounds at most, maybe $20, $30. So it's worthwhile. We were talking about radios earlier on. I tend to do my trips with these, Aircraft KX3, but I've also done the expeditions with this little thing. So this has got to be the smallest thing. This is an ATS-3B. I've modified it and added a couple extra band filters to it, but basically this is a full CW rig that's frequency agile. So if your setup on the expedition is 2 radios, that's not exactly the largest, heaviest load ever. So any questions? No.
We had one question about the propagation chart, but
Okay. I can answer that. It's fine.
Yeah. They were just asking about interpreting it, and I was talking that the left side shows the frequency going up, and the bottom edge is the time of day. So it's important to look at both of those. Yeah.
The way let me pull the slide up. Steve Nichols is going to do a presentation. I think later on this afternoon.
Yes.
So basically, it's going to be useful to see his presentation. But let me just pull it up for a second.
That'll be at 12:40 Zulu.
Yeah. Basically, if you look at the very far right-hand side, there's the
the share didn't come up.
Huh?
Go ahead and share again.
The share didn't come up. Okay, let's try this again.
Okay.
Is there now?
Yes.
Right. So on the far right-hand side, basically, you've got a graph that goes from 0 to 100%, and it's color-coded. So the graph shows many things all at the same time. The red line going from one side of the graph to the other one is what they refer to as the maximum usable frequency. I'm sure there's technical details, but basically that gives you an idea of what the actual frequency, the maximum usable frequency you can usually use on this particular circuit. They call it a circuit. This is from American Samoa to London. over a period of time. And then inside that graph, it changes the color on what the percentage suggestion is of the reliability of contact during that period of time. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question that was asked?
Yes.
Okay. So in this particular instance, this is a case of, it was about 60%, maybe 70% likely that someone was going to be able to get in touch with me if they contacted me on this particular frequency. I've got to remember exactly where it is, but there'll
Looks
be a
like
frequency.
15 meters.
Yeah, 15 meters. At about 12 o'clock UTC. It was someone who was literally just down the road from me, basically. I knew he had a very, very good antenna system. Basically, he had a 3-element Yagi basically up at 10 meters. So, to be honest, he wasn't a QRP station, but he desperately wanted to get American Samoa. So, right,
Could you, Dom, could you tell them where that site, what the site is that you got that from?
This wasn't actually a site. This was actually a piece of software.
Okay, so this is the vocab software?
Yep, it is indeed. What you
Very
do is you put in the details of the circuit, effectively the location, the start, the destination, who wants to listen to, and then under it you can see there's a transmitter receiver. So you actually put the details in and press go, and it generates it. It's not 100% accurate, but it's a pretty good idea of what's going on. In this graph, you can see it's absolutely it's obvious. There's no point between 20 UTC and 4 in the morning UTC trying to operate between American Samoa and London. Now you've got to remember, this is the other side of the world. So this is basically between 8 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Don't bother trying. So I will say I spent an awful lot of time in American Samoa on the beach at night trying to operate back to the UK. It's the only time the circuit was open. So that's propagation like this is probably useful and interesting. A lot of the recent DXpeditions have published generic type charts like this for, let me see if I can think of one. Some of the recent sort of like Peter Island and Bouvet Island, some of the really, really big DXpeditions, they've turned around and said, for certain regions, this is what we suggest is going to be the likelihood of contact. My guess is what they've probably used is both on the ground, previous operators, previous experts, what have they actually managed to get, who they've contacted and when, etc. And they've actually used things like vocab as well. Does that make sense?
Very good.
Yep. Okay, so we'll go back there. So the rest of my equipment, lock and lock boxes, float bags, I've mentioned, antenna analyzer. Everyone in the conferences basically probably listen to Heather's talk about antenna analyzers. There's a lot of different choices. Mini VNA, the NAT, the nano VNA, etc. There's lots of different antenna analyzers. You've got to figure out what works for you. I started off initially with an MFJ 269, but it's a big clunky thing. There's no way on earth I'm going to put that in my luggage, carry-on luggage. So I've actually got a literally tiny little thing, which is about the same size as what would you call it? A cigarette packet in America, with a couple of B and C's at one end. I take that if I've got a problem or I need to literally analyze something or figure out if feed line's the right length, etc. Plug it into the laptop, basically get whatever I need to out of it. It's a laptop, so to be honest, you've got a 15-inch screen. You're not going to get that on any kind of kit you're going to want to take in a bag anyway. So does that work? Socket tester I've already talked about. Marigold gloves. What we're talking about is sort of rubberized dish gloves. This may sound daft, but the number of times I've actually operated in a place where the earth that's been used by the hotel or the rooms or the villa I've rented or whatever else has actually been lethal, absolutely lethal. So you connect everything up basically, and the first piece of metal you touch basically, your fingers tingle, they zap, and all the rest of it.
Another thing I found very good to have the rubber gloves for is if you use any kind of collapsing fiberglass pole, a lot of times they'll get stuck, and the only way to get them loose is by twisting them with rubber gloves on. Yeah,
especially if they're dry. Yeah, especially if the rubber gloves stay dry, basically, that's a really, really wonderful, that's a lovely tip of how exactly to actually take your poles apart. don't get involved in doing the thing of literally sort of like bashing the pole down on the ground. On what I say, don't do that, because you're going to end up sort of like damaging things. Just twist it slowly, 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 and as long as the rubber gloves are dry enough, it works. I have actually I looked. I haven't actually got one to hand because in this current lockdown, I haven't been on any trips recently. But I've got a tiny little closed circuit TV PSU. It's basically the size of it is about the same as a power brick you'd actually get for a standard laptop. And because it's CCTV and it's digital, etc., it's incredibly reliable. And the nice thing is that they tend to be switch mode. So they'll go anything from sort of like 90 volts all the way up to whatever, to 260 or 270. They don't tend to create an awful lot of hash. You can usually find them on AliExpress or eBay or any of these auction sites, and they probably cost an awful lot less than what the official ones you'd get through sort of like Ham Outlet or here in England, it'd be sort of like Martin Lynch or something like that. What they sell is probably perfect. But at the end of the day, if you're willing to actually investigate and do a bit of sort of work yourself, basically, those things work. Antenna bits for obvious reasons. I find a clock as a compass is important because the number of times you get on a beach and you try to figure out which way's north, you get disorientated with time zone changes. You're only there for a short period of time, so it's a bit difficult to figure out which way's north, which way's south, etc. A clock for obvious reasons. You want to make certain you get something which has got the possibility these days of having a GPS lock to it. I've got one of these little Oregon scientific things. They're not the heaviest thing on earth, but basically it's a GPS receiver clock, and it works incredibly well. If you've ever been to the tropics, those of you that have never been, you may not understand this one, but basically when the sun goes down, it gets dark. It gets very dark very, very quickly. So it's important to actually have a torch. This is the equipment list. So what does this potentially actually look like? Well, that's a setup that I had with me when I was in Sweden. Laptop, as I said, basically headphones. The number of times you're actually working where you probably don't want to actually either disturb anyone else by the sound coming out of your radio, or your radio, in this case a KX3, it's got somewhat limited audio capability, so it's much better to actually stick a set of headphones on. The top left is actually a tuner. I don't tend to use them if I can help it, but every now and then basically they are useful. I've got both KX3s. The reason there's two, they don't have to be KX3s, they can be another radio. I also use SDRs as well, receivers. It's very, very useful to actually have, if you've got more than one antenna set up, you connect the other radio that you're not using to that antenna and just watch and wait for the opening to happen. Sometimes openings are not open for very long, so it's important to literally just capture that. I'm sure those people who operate on low frequencies know about the sort of like the sort of 15-20 minute lag when on top band and 80 meters that happen between certain parts of the world and other parts on the grey line, where basically what will happen is basically top band will suddenly literally appear and then disappear, and then you can almost rely on it about 15-20 minutes later on. Basically the same thing will happen on 80 meters. Again, if you haven't got a second radio set up, you might miss it. On that table, basically, you can actually see the big blue thing. Basically, is it's an emergency battery which actually was present in the shack at the time, and that's actually what's powering everything on the table. And that brings me to the following: is power. Do you use mains power or not? The number of times and number of places I've been to, there's no mains power available whatsoever. So I've actually spent a fair amount of time investigating alternatives. I think we all know about field day generators, but it's amazing solar power, solar technology these days. And the number of DX locations you go to, it may be a fair amount of weighty kit to take with you, but you'd be amazed at the number of locals who literally would probably love the idea of literally someone from Western country, turning around and actually taking a solar panel and actually gifting it to them afterwards. There's batteries. That battery on the right, the picture, it's kind of interesting. That's actually a forklift truck next to it. So it's a bit of a joke, but I figured this one out. It actually had Anderson power pole connections to it. This would actually come out of a fishing boat. So it's one side of a 24-volt supply. There's a talk that's going on tomorrow, Bill. That's the ID if anyone wants to note it. It's in the program anyway. He's talking about battery operating with QRP. Antenna choice. This is a difficult one. 9 times out of 10, you've got to actually go with what you're familiar with. There's a piece of software called EasyNet or ESNEC. It echoes Zulu November Echo Charlie. If you just do a Google search for it, you'll find it. There is a demo version. It's limited in some, it's crippled in some ways, but basically, if you use it, it's very, very useful to literally investigate the antenna that you think you might want to take with you and figure out exactly what it's like. If you're going to be in a DX location, you really need a low angle of radiation of your signal. So I would suggest you need to literally investigate EasyNet, etc., and have a look at that. It used to be several years ago, basically, a DXpedition had to take a multiple element Yagi with a mast, etc. Not anymore. It's probably just as good, if not better, in some cases, to actually take a couple of verticals and phase them by water, and it works. Is it worthwhile taking a QRM device and or ferrites? It's a question I get asked on a regular basis. Yes and no. Because you're QRP, and 9 times out of 10 you're actually operating battery power or whatever else, if you've actually got an awful lot of QRM and hash and all the rest of it on one set of frequencies, just move to somewhere else. On 2 meters of all things, and I took a taxi trip that actually literally took me down the coastline. And as I was going, basically, I noted on a tourist map that I got from the hotel which places had higher noise than others. And that then became an investigation to figure out where was the best place for me to actually go with my antenna. You can actually buy QRM devices. You can make them as well. Ferrites. You've got to look at what frequency you're going to be operating at, but basically you need to basically make certain you get the best possible ferrite material for the frequencies you're using. We're talking about 43 or 77 or 63, etc. You can get little clip-on ferrites as well. See if I've got one to hand. No, they're normally all being used. But one of the things that sometimes happens is, I'll just stop the share for a second. I found you do get feedback from your microphone and headphones. So this is what I do on mine. Is basically it's just a single loop through, little tiny ferrite, and a bit of heat shrink. That will probably reduce all of the possible feedback I would get out of my PC, etc., into my headphones, etc. You can do similar things on your feeders into your coax, etc. Feeders into your antenna from your radio. I've used air-wound balance, etc. I've also used sort of like 4-to-1 balance, which basically is literally just a very, very simple sort of like doubled up winding on an FT 114 43 core, I believe, and ends up being a 4-to-1 balance. Again, you can find lots of designs for these. I've got to remember the call sign N5ESE. N5ESE has actually got, if you do web search for that, basically, he's got lots of different designs. It's worthwhile at least having them if you need them, or having the materials so you can make one on site if you really need to. Let's go back to sharing again. Any questions while I do this?
One question had to do with your packing and check-in. Do you try to bring everything in a carry-on bag, or do you?
You can't always. Some airlines have actually changed the rules. They won't let you carry on much more than sort of a calculator. A couple of years ago, basically, there was a strange rule that happened on an awful lot of flights in and out of the Far East, where everything had to be sort of like in tiny little see-through clear bags. You weren't allowed to take sort of like liquid more than a certain volume, etc. As far as whether or not you need to take everything as carry-on or not, the bag I showed you before basically it serves both roles. It can either be a carry-on bag and it actually fits, or it can go into the hold. I'll be honest, I work as an IT consultant basically, and I've traveled globally. I've traveled thousands and thousands of miles. I've honestly, touch wood, never actually lost a bag. But there's a couple of important things you need to do. You need to basically make certain you label it on the outside and on the inside with who you are, where you're going to, what your flight numbers are, what your emergency contact numbers are. It can't be overstressed that, because the last thing they want to do is literally, of course, if you open the bag, you'll say, oh yeah, that's my bag, I can recognize it, that's my pair of shorts. But that doesn't help the person in baggage collection and all the rest of it. Your bag, say, maybe split open or whatever else, and they've got no idea what's there.
Have you had any issues with customs or bringing equipment into some of the countries?
Yes. The only place I've actually had problems with, well, if you go into any of the African countries, what's an experience that most people don't realize is they tend to x-ray kit on the way in. And what they do is they x-ray your bags, and the reason they're doing that is they're trying to figure out what's in the bag. If you look as if you're literally a standard tourist, where these days basically that means you've got your iPhone or your iPod, your iPad and all the rest of it, they tend to sort of not bother. Someone suddenly turns around and walks through basically, and it's identified, they've got a whole load of wires, they've got radios and all the rest of it. People will stop and ask you questions. So make certain you're prepared. Remember, the person you're speaking to may not actually know what amateur radio is all about. It's probably useful to have 1 or 2 magazines with you in your bag or whatever else. Apart from anything else, you can read them on the flight. Or you never know, someone else on the flight might be interested in literally the subject. So that when you actually land and have one of these situations, you can actually explain to someone, you're not a spy, it's not nefarious, it's not, you know, there's nothing wrong with having this stuff, basically. You are a licensed amateur. The only time I've ever actually had more serious problems is when basically you try to do that at odd times of the night. I was flying from Gambia back to Morocco, then on to Europe, but the time of my flight leaving Gambia was about 2 o'clock in the morning, which doesn't help because the security guards tend to be a bit more twitchy at night in some of these locations. So. But yeah, no major problems. I've spoken to and I've seen a few people where basically they have had issues. The important thing is you need to basically make certain you stay calm. The last thing you want to do is get annoyed with these people because they have the ability to stop you getting on your flight. But the only thing that might possibly happen is if it either looks too expensive or too new, is they're probably looking for backsheesh or something. They're looking for some sort of like, how do I put it, a donation. But that's all.
Due to some technical difficulties earlier, Dom was unable to complete his presentation. We're going to allow him to do that now. There will not be any Q&A for Dom's session. If you do have a question, you can go ahead and put that into the chat. It will not be answered now, but we'll try to forward that over to Dom at some point. So Dom, I will go ahead and turn the session over to you.
Thanks very much, John. Just to let everyone know, I was talking about DXpeditions. Basically, the next thing that people need to literally look at is the use of the internet, both before, after, and during any expedition. It's incredibly important these days, basically, to basically make certain you get all of your social media stuff in line. And that includes DX News and, as I said, in QRZ. You've got to make certain, basically, if you're advertising you're going to be doing something or you're going to be going somewhere, you need to make certain that you get your messages right, so people know exactly what to do. Some people, as I found out on some of my trips, have been waiting sort of 20, 30 years to actually get a QRP operator in some of these locations. So it's incredibly vital for them, if not for you, to basically make certain you get everything correct. One thing that happens whilst you're in the expedition, basically, it's too late to really think about it an awful lot, but the internet has included things like reverse beacon network, or RBN as everyone calls it these days, and DX cluster. Now, DX cluster is kind of fun, but it can also be an absolute nightmare. And one of the things I've definitely found out, basically, it frankly just attracts idiots sometimes. The number of times, basically, you get people turn around and it's very clear you've advertised you're going somewhere. Basically, you're using a vertical, it's a ground plane, you've got absolutely no directivity whatsoever. They turn around and say, please, can you beam to such and such? So unfortunately, basically, you get DX cluster spots all over the place, or people turn around and say, he's deaf, which is not the most helpful thing on earth, when basically you can't actually hear them because probably they haven't got their own antenna connected. Anyway, one thing that's very, very important to mention, basically, if you're going to do a DXpedition and it's QRP, is a pileup is definitely not our friend. One of the things you need to also think about is you're going to probably be operating what's known as split, either on CW or SSB. That basically means you transmit on one frequency and you listen on another frequency or a range of frequencies. Now, unfortunately, if you're running as a QRP operator, that means by default, you're actually transmitting a very weak signal by comparison with most operators. That means that if people see a DX spot that turn around and state which frequency you're transmitting on, 9 times out of 10, these people will just go click, 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 and literally transmit all over your transmit frequency. So one of the most important things you need to do when you're actually in a DX location is keep a monitor on for yourself on your DX frequency. One of the things that happens an awful lot is if people do this, basically, as in they transmit on your frequency, you'll find an awful lot of people will actually turn around and quite happily tell people to stop doing it, as has happened to me on a few locations. The other thing is basically it's definitely a worldwide audience. I've got an audio clip that I'm not going to play this time, but basically you will have an audience of call signs coming back to you, most of which you've never heard before in your life. Unless you happen to have worked all 339 DXCCs and all the rest of bits and pieces, you'll probably recognize them all, but there will be some that you won't. So it's quite interesting sometimes, basically, what actually happens. And if you make mistakes, people know about it. Right, a lot of the big DXpeditions basically use what's called pilot stations. What this is basically, this is a station in a locality where they expect to get an awful lot of contacts from. And what they do is that station will keep in touch with the DXpedition, basically, to figure out what's going on with propagation, when's a good time to make a contact, etc. I'll be honest, myself, I've never actually used it. Having said that, I have literally on occasions, basically, when I've been somewhere, basically got in touch with people back home, and people have turned around and said, oh, you're really loud at such and such a time, etc. Pilot stations are probably something you want to literally look at as time goes on, especially with a decent link into some sort of social media, Twitter, etc. So there's that. Remote SDRs. I was lucky enough to actually be able to set up some pretty amazing SDRs as well. And on one of the trips I was on, basically, the screen image you're seeing there, basically, is I was actually able to actually run an SDR on 40 meters whilst I was actually down in Gambia. And whilst I was there, basically, I was able to actually see what was going on locally, as in back in the UK, with me in the remote location. Unfortunately, someone had decided to actually plop their transmit signal right on top of my own transmit signal, not by accident, but basically as a contest. So basically, they were just getting on with it. In the image, you can actually see it there. But this sort of thing is very, very useful. If I happen to have been a bit more frequency agile as to what I was up to, basically, I would have seen basically there was a gap just off to one side, basically. But it explains an awful lot, a lot that had happened at the time. One of the things that's happened an awful lot with some of the big DXpeditions, basically, is people are expecting almost instantaneous uploads of QSOs to Logbook of the World, etc. the way most of these organizations actually achieve this is what's known as satellite uploads. I don't know if anyone's actually investigated how much these things cost, but if you think mobile phones cost an awful lot normally, then you'll be kidding when you actually take a look at what satellite uploads cost. Having said that, though, the costs are coming down and down and down and down, and with all of this recent activity with Elon Musk, etc., sort of like launching satellites everywhere, I'm pretty certain this is going to be an interesting area to see what happens in the next few years. One of the things, again, with DXpeditions you need to look at is your health. It's very, very important, basically, to make certain all of your inoculations are up to date. I'm talking about sort of like typhoid and cholera and yellow fever and things like that. Don't just ignore them. You need to just absolutely make certain you've actually got these things in place, because some of the places you're going to be going to are literally third world, and the last thing you want to do is literally end up being medevaced because basically you've scratched yourself on a piece of rusty metal or whatever else and basically giving yourself tetanus. Mosquitoes and other animals that bite and itch, etc. Unfortunately, these are going to happen. You better get used to it. Mosquitoes, especially, just about everywhere I've been, especially in Africa, seem to just love us. So basically, we're food, we're game. If you're going to go anywhere it's hot, basically expect to get sunburnt. A hat, shirt, and sunglasses will help an awful lot more than sunblock ever will. There's nothing worse than trying to actually run a pilot when you've actually got sunburn, as I can attest to. I've done that for several hours. At the end of a expedition, one of the things you do need to literally look at or think about is how you're going to QSL. Now, years ago, basically, all IOTA trips I went on, basically, physical cards were essential because the checkers didn't want to accept anything else. These days, things have changed an awful lot, basically, and it's now possible to actually sort out logs electronically. There's Club Log, there's Logbook of the World, etc., etc. One of the things that's useful to know is basically once you've created your log and you're going to be signing it to Logbook of the World for an upload, basically you can use exactly the same file for Club Log. So that's useful. Have a look if you're getting an awful lot of QSO requests from specific geographic locations, basically when you actually get back and you've got to send them back out. Rather than using your own QSL Bureau for sending out cards, especially if you've actually got quite a few of them, it might be better to actually send them directly to the Foreign Bureau. I'm sure the RSGB QSL Bureau managers will help you with that. One of the other things is basically QSLing is a bit of a pain in the neck, to be honest, sometimes. After DXpeditions, basically, you've got to manage and look after an awful lot of QSL cards. It's useful sometimes to possibly contemplate using a QSL manager, especially if you're looking to try to see if you can actually raise any funds, etc. From QSLing. And one of the ones I'm very well aware of is a chap called M0OXO. So it's probably worthwhile having a look at. Anyway, those that might want to have a look at doing a DXpedition, perhaps as a holiday, because that's probably one of the easiest way to do it. These are a few of my hints and suggestions, which I'll make, which I'll leave up there so anyone can take any notes. I was going to raise any questions, but I'm now going to be handing straight over to Steve.
Okay, thank you very much, Dom, and your flexibility with crossing a couple of different sessions. If you have any questions for Dom, if you want to put those in the chat, we won't be answering those today, but I'll try to make sure that we get that information to him. So on behalf of the G-QRP Club, Dom, thank you very much for the presentation.